Welcome everyone to the story Genesis Session 3. This week we are exploring the story of the flood found in Genesis chapters 7 and 8. I invite you to have your Bible close to your side and something to write with so that you can take notes and make this story your own. I also invite you now to pause this video for just a few minutes so that you can take some time to read these two chapters in your Bible. The heart of the flood story is found in Genesis chapters 7 and 8. I invite you now to pause the video and read these two chapters. Well, the story of the flood is certainly one that almost all of us are familiar with, regardless of whether people are people of faith or whether they have been brought up in the church or not. The story of the flood and Noah's Ark that is familiar to most, and it is a story that has been picked up by popular culture, from the movie Evan Almighty to decorations that you might use in your child's nursery. As we begin exploring this well-known story, it is important for me to share with you a reflection by Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann. Walter Brueggemann points out that this story of the flood is best read not as history, nor is it best read as myth. Brueggemann argues, and I agree, that the story of the flood found in Genesis is best read as proclamation. The point of the story is not the details of the flood or the animals or the building of the ark or even Noah. In Brueggemann's words, the story of the flood found in Genesis is the announcement of what God has done about our fractured world. In other words, what is most important about this story is what it reveals to us about God. In order to fully understand Genesis chapters 7 and 8, we have to first go back a bit to Genesis chapter 6. In Genesis chapter 6, God is frustrated with God's people and even regrets having created them. God says, "I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." God here is not so much angry at God's people as God is grieved and saddened and heartbroken over how God's people, the work of God's own hand, are acting. God created humans to be in perfect relationship both with God and with each other. Yet this is far from how humans were living. Sin, as we learned last week, had entered the picture and had changed everything. Noah, however, finds favor in God's sight. In chapter 6, verse 9b, we read, "Noah walked with God." Faithful Noah is humanity as God intended humanity to be. In relationship with God, Noah here in Genesis chapter 6 is the very model of faith. God commands Noah to build an ark and establishes a covenant relationship with Noah and his family. In chapter 6, verse 18, we read, "But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you." Every time we read of God making a covenant with God's people, it is important to understand what such covenants mean. When God makes a covenant with God's people, as God here does with Noah, the initiation of the covenant always rests on God and not God's people. It is God's faithfulness to the covenant that makes the covenant good. Instead of resting on the work or the acts or the faithfulness of God's people, God's covenants rest only on God's faithfulness, on God's promise. That takes us to Genesis chapter 7. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 1, God commands Noah to go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. God commands Noah to take with him into the ark 7 pairs of all clean animals and 1 pair of all unclean animals, and 7 pairs of all the birds of the air. In verse 4, we read that God shares with Noah that this flood is going to last for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 is a significant number throughout the scriptural story. Nearly every time that 40 is referenced, whether it was the 40 years of wilderness wandering by God's people Israel after they left their slavery in Egypt, or whether it is the 40 days that Jesus was tempted by Satan in the wilderness, or whether here it is the 40 days and nights of rain that fell upon the earth, 40 always represents a period of testing, a period of challenge, a period of trial, a period in which God's people were desperate for God to come and save them. The flood comes just as God told Noah that it would. And in verse 23 of chapter 7 we read, God blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. The story turns, a most significant turn, at the beginning of Genesis chapter 8. In fact, if there is one verse that I would encourage you to underline or highlight or circle throughout today's study, chapter 8, verse 1 is it. But God remembered Noah. Despite how filled with grief and sadness and how much of a broken heart God had, God remembers Noah and Noah's family. God remembers the promises, the covenant that God made with him. God keeps God's promises. God is always faithful. After 150 days of floating on the waters that resulted from the 40 days and nights of rainfall, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. At the end of 40 days, Noah opens a window on the ark and sends out a raven. Next, he sends out a dove. But the dove finds no place to set its foot and returns to the ark, alerting Noah that it is not yet safe to exit the ark. Noah waits another 7 days. He sends out the dove yet again, and this time the dove comes back with a freshly plucked olive leaf. The waters were beginning to recede. An olive branch had been made visible, and the dove was able to find a leaf. But because the dove returned yet again, Noah knew again that it was not yet safe to exit the ark. Noah waits another 7 days and sends the dove out a third time, and this time it does not return. Now it was safe for Noah and Noah's people, together with all of the animals, to exit the ark. Noah removes the covering of the ark, and Noah sees that the waters are drying up. God commands Noah to go out of the ark. God had saved Noah and Noah's family just as God had promised them. And in response to God's gift of grace to Noah, in response to God's act of deliverance, what does Noah do? He worships. Noah builds an altar to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. In chapter 8, verse 21, we read, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." That takes us to Genesis chapter 9, where we get the conclusion to the story. Beginning with verse 8 and following, God establishes God's covenant with Noah and Noah's descendants. In verse 11 of chapter 9, God says, "I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." Again, we see that God's covenant with us depends not on our own goodness or on our own turning to God. The inclinations of the human heart remain evil, God reminds us. But rather, God's covenant depends only on God's own turning toward us. Thus, again, Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann comments, "What has changed in this story is not anything about humankind or creation or waters or floods. What has changed is God. God has made a decision about the grief and the trouble of his own heart." In verses 12 and 13, God places the rainbow in the sky as a sign of God's covenant. It is a visual reminder that God remembers God's promises. When the bow is in the clouds, God says, "I will see it," and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. In a very real sense, God hangs up his bow, his weapon of destruction, and turns it into a reminder of God's promises. The most significant detail about the rainbow is something that we usually miss and indeed get entirely backwards. We tend to think that the rainbow is a reminder to us of God's promises, reminding us of God's promise never to destroy the earth by a flood again. But if we read this text carefully, God set the rainbow in the sky not as a reminder to us, but rather as a reminder to God. It is as if the rainbow in the sky is God tying a piece of string around his finger, so that every time God sees the rainbow, God might remember, "Oh yeah, I promise to be faithful." And God always keeps God's promises. The point of the story of Noah and the flood is that we have a God who remembers. We have a God who remembers us, no matter how many times we fail. God has made a promise to us, and God will always be faithful.